Hi, and welcome to the Rethinking Trauma and Transition podcast, where we challenge the stigma surrounding trauma and healing through our conversations. We aim to empower whoever's listening, who are experiencing the challenges that we talk about, and provide them with the knowledge and in some cases the language necessary to embark on their own transformative journey towards a more fulfilling life. We hope you enjoy our conversations. So what are we talking about this week, Rich?
We are, Annie. We're going back over a little bit about boundaries, values, beliefs, and maybe touch on self-reliance and independence.
Yeah, because we had quite a detailed conversation in the last episode about that push me, pull me effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did.
Touched on the purpose of boundaries, but we didn't necessarily explore that in any great depth. That was more focusing on that change experience in a way, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
So I know from the conversation you and I were having just before we started, we were talking about the link between that conversation and the military mindset.
We were, yeah. And so when we're in the forces, or any big organisation really, such as maybe the police, fire brigade, first response as well, these kind of people, it is generally all about the organisation and being with that organisation. So our values come secondary to that main mission, what that mission is for that organisation. So then leaving ourselves secondary, which then can potentially compromise our values and our beliefs about ourselves, where we're not establishing those boundaries that maybe in other places that people do have and grown up with.
It reminds me a lot of a phrase that a client gave me, which is thee before me.
Yeah.
And when I'm thinking about it, one of the things that strikes me is that it's not necessarily an absence of boundaries, it's a displacement of boundaries. So if we think about our boundaries almost being a natural perimeter, it's almost like we've taken our perimeter and we've placed it around everybody else and forgotten to step behind it ourselves.
Well, I think people can imagine it as we were discussing earlier, Ali, so we've got those zones, haven't we? The intimate zone, the personal zone, social zone, and how much distance separated we are happy with having contact with these people, depending on context, obviously. Mm-hmm. So the more those boundaries get encroached with unfamiliar people, the more uncomfortable it does become, especially in the Western world.
Yeah, and I think everybody's probably come across somebody that is unaware of the kind of limitations or very, very oblivious to that concept of personal space. I was saying to Rich earlier that I worked with somebody who I used to try and, if I was having a conversation with them, I used to try and have that while I was walking, because otherwise it would get to the point where I'd be backed up into a corner against a wall because I was constantly in retreat while they were invading that concept of my personal space.
Yeah. So I don't know whoever's seen them, is what happens on occasion is mice, when they're attacked by a cat, they will actually go for that cat, which is complete context change for the cat. So that really does take the cat by surprise, scares it, the cat runs off, and the mouse is free to live another day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's almost like that encroachment in the cat's personal space that's not expecting it, so automatically backs away.
Yeah, definitely.
So that idea of boundaries and that the link to the military mindset links in very nicely to that concept of push me, pull me as well, because the whole point of that is how odd it can sometimes feel, how unnatural it can feel when we are changing our beliefs, our expectations or our behaviours, because we're stepping outside of established patterns. We're in effect exploring new territory.
Yeah. But with organisations such as the military, we go through a whole process of 10 weeks of basic training, then off to trade training, whatever else it is. And so those boundaries or that setting is then brought into us. It is there with us all throughout that training. So it's always there, conditioned to go, yeah, this is what the mission is, and you are secondary to that mission. You're working as a team, you're looking out for your oppos, you mentioned previous ones. And that's what the main thing that matters is the mission and your mates.
So that is that's that displacement of our personal boundaries, isn't it? Where we are taking our sense of self, and instead of it being wrapped around ourselves in terms of our expectations and our prioritization in it, we're literally taking that and placing it around everybody else, while we, in effect, are standing outside. It's almost like a giant multi-layered Venn diagram, isn't it? Where we're hoping that everybody else's displacement will at some point keep us safe.
Yeah. What I did forget to mention in the previous military mindset is it's always your weapon first. If your weapon is not functioning properly, you can't utilize it. Your equipment, then it's yourself. So you've got that 3-stage layer as well, again on top, which is everything else by yourself. And then when you more of a senior, you go through the ranks, become officer or however it is, it's always the junior ranks, the privates, guardsmen, troopers, sappers, whoever it is. They're always one step first, one's looked after first, then it is the chain of command looks after themselves afterwards. So again, there's another displacement of boundaries there to sort of the people out before you're looking after yourself. Get that?
Yeah. And what happens when you translate that in outside of that structure is you find then that your boundaries aren't actually attached to you, they're attached to everyone else.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that can burn you out really quickly. It also can have quite an impact in terms of our own sense of value and sense of worth. So that when we have to try and reorientate those displaced boundaries back to sitting naturally round about us, it feels very alien because it doesn't match with our beliefs in terms of our worth compared to everyone else's, our value compared to everyone else's.
Yeah, well, we're looking at others' needs and wants first before our own. And so looking after other people is the essential thing, because hopefully they're doing the same for you.
So if you're working in an organization where everyone's boundaries are displaced in a similar fashion, that works really well.
Yes.
But that's not what happens in civilian street.
No. In the vast majority of cases, no. There might be some people where you're working and they're doing that similar sort of thing, but ultimately they depend on where they are in the organization and the hierarchy. Because if you've got poor management, poor leadership, they're not going to be able to, the organization's not going to function well, is it?
Well, as I'm working through this, kind of what were you going to say?
I was going it's a similar thing, but on a very limited scope. It's the more limited scope, isn't it? Where people are, they maybe get paid to go on a call out, so they may get extra pay, what say 30 quid, 50 quid, whatever it is, to be on a call out. Where we don't get out in the forces, it is they're expected to go out and do that job.
But that can also apply. We can also do that to ourselves. if even when we have no military background. And that comes back to where we place our value and our worth. Comes back to that sense of what purpose do I serve in this? And it comes back to that identity jigsaw, where sometimes the pieces are not in balance.
Yeah.
All the component parts that make us who we are. And one part might, as a defense mechanism, almost grow to almost mask or protect the other pieces, but in doing so actually erodes the size of that piece or the potential of that piece. You see that quite commonly, for instance, where you've got workaholic traits, where it might start off as a defensive mechanism, as a protective mechanism, but actually the actual habits of it erode the presence of the other pieces till some of them just don't exist. And those are quite often our social interactions or relationships outside of a specific setting. And part and parcel of what feeds that behaviour is that sense of not assessing the priorities in terms of your individual needs.
Yeah.
Because the corporation or the organisation or everybody else within it, your mask is looking after them rather than looking after you.
Yeah. Which you mentioned previously, Ali, was a devalue, wasn't it? So it's a devalue of that person's self-worth, that person's self-esteem, and that eventually gets eroded. So I know my friend Orlando, who goes on about there's no such thing as a scale of self-worth or self-esteem and that kind of stuff, because each means a different level to different people. And if you're not valuing yourself or what you're doing, then there's another compromise there somewhere.
It isn't. I think the important part of that is that word compromise. Because in some cases, a compromise is positive. But when it comes to our sense of self, our sense of self-worth, and our sense of value, actually a compromise is not positive. It's an erosion.
Yeah.
It's a damage and a reduction of our sense of worth. Because in that compromise, we're not valuing ourselves. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we can't, in a different sense, reach compromises with other people, because that's not about our worth. That's about a specific action or activity or outcome.
Well, that's about relationships, really, isn't it?
Yeah. But when we are compromised, when our values are compromised, when our sense of value is compromised, whether that's by our own actions or other people's, then it's a detraction and a reduction of our value and worth.
Yeah. And that is a problem, is looking to rebuild that back up. Because if it's been eroded over time, people may not have an idea of where to turn to or who to turn to. Or the other side of things, as we mentioned previously, is the analogy of the boiling frog. You've been putting, no, it's not true, but frog's been put in cold water, and eventually the heat gets up and frog gets used to that heat and it boils itself alive. Which isn't true anyway, but it's an analogy to go and find out.
Well, that's the normalizing of our experience, isn't it? Where over a period of time, if the experience is protracted, we build it into our sense of normal, so that we cease to acknowledge it. You know, whether that's somebody's behavior that consistently puts us down, or whether that's maybe an emotion we're feeling, or a lack of emotion we're feeling, it becomes, over a period of time when that's protracted, part of our normal. And the thing about our normal is it becomes unacknowledged by us because we're programmed to acknowledge the different. Otherwise, we'd been overwhelmed. And when we cease to acknowledge that lack of worth, it's very difficult when we're forced to, when we actually have to assess that.
Yeah. It's
because by that,
carry on, Ali.
well, by that point, that's shifted our beliefs about ourselves as well.
What I was going to say is, if that's our normal of being devalued, abused, bullied in a, say, work environment, and living with that normal, we're going back to that pattern recognition and that familiarity of that pattern, and how used to we get to those patterns.
And this is where sometimes these patterns repeat. We're not intentionally seeking them out, but there's almost a sense of comfort. That's why you might find that somebody who maybe has experienced very volatile relationships in the family home as they're growing up, their experience of relationships and the relationships they will seek out will be similarly volatile, or can be.
Yeah.
Because there's pattern recognition at play there. That is normal. That is the definition of their experience. And it can feel quite alien to try and change that.
Definitely. And with some of that can lead to over self-reliance and independence, where because being in those relationships, there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of support within that family structure or that organizational structure even. We're not willing or wanting to ask people because we know that we have a belief that they'll let us down or they won't follow through, because we have that expectation of this happening time and time again. And there's that pattern continuously coming through on that.
Well, I think there also becomes almost pattern avoidance, because we have already experienced that repeatedly. We know it hurts. We know this isn't something we want. So actually what we do is actively seek to eliminate its possibility. The problem then is, as you say, is we end up with that over self-reliance, the inability to reach out and ask for help or accept help if it's offered, where actually that offering of help, rather than it being a positive for us, becomes a negative experience because it places us in a place of vulnerability and potential letdown and hurt. So therefore, we revert to the rejection of that and the inability to accept it.
Yeah.
Because our protective instincts are kicking in. We would rather not take the risk than accept and be let down again.
Well, it also even goes as far as asking people questions. That's opening yourself up to, as you mentioned earlier, about being vulnerable. So I'll give you an example of this. Many years ago, I did some rock climbing at school, and it must take, or seemed to take me about an hour to ask these two people a question about rock climbing. They just didn't know how to ask. Well, I wanted to ask, but didn't have that confidence or that ability to ask these guys a question about, I can't remember what it was now, it's a long time ago. It just felt really, really bad to do so.
And that's often because it places us in the spotlight for a moment. And if we're in an avoidance situation where the last thing we want to do is draw attention to ourselves, for us to be seen, and I'm picking my words very carefully, because sometimes we will construct masks and we will operate from behind the mask, and we're happy for the mask to be seen, but we're not happy for us to be seen. And again, this is really where what we're touching on here is ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and the impact that has in terms of adults as well. Because that also means that you've what you then have is not only are you overly self-reliant within that, but it's also going to be really difficult in terms of placement of trust and actually that building of relationships, because that places you in a point of being in the spotlight, of being seen, and you're used to operating behind the mask, and the mask is fine, and there's almost a public persona that sits up there that says, I'm okay, Jack.
Yeah.
But
kind of built an artificial boundary.
it is an artificial boundary, yeah.
That nobody can encroach on this space, even though it needs to be encroached upon. It's not a healthy one.
I sometimes use an analogy when I'm working with people in this, that in a way it's a bit between, but it's the difference between standing on a rock and standing in pebbles. Because when we are coming from that position of over self-reliance, of masking our true self, of avoidance of vulnerability, when we are unclear on our boundaries and we have that issue in terms of the beliefs we have about our own value, our own worth, what we have a tendency to do when we do break out of that sometimes is you put all our eggs in one basket. We can be in a position where, because our boundaries are unclear, we overshare.
Mm-hmm.
Because it takes so much, when we do let people in, then it's almost like, well, it becomes fully invested in that because it's such a big risk, such a big step. Now, that's a bit like standing on a boulder, standing on a rock. On the surface of it, that might seem quite steady. But the alternative is standing on pebbles. Now, the difference there is that the investment is spread. There's a diffusion of the investments. It's not invested in one thing or one person. It's invested across multiples. It's invested in small pockets as we grow in our ability to make that investment. What that means and why there's a difference between the two is when that rock shifts, when something happens to that rock or with that rock, we are unbalanced, we fall, we are hurt. When we're standing on pebbles and a pebble shifts, the others move to accommodate it and we're still supported. And that's about building and investing not in one but in many, so that we are building a network of support, so that actually reaching out and asking for help isn't such a vested event, because we don't just have one person to ask. There's 2 or 3 within our circle that we can go, I need a hand with. Is anybody available? It means when one person says no, it doesn't hurt, because there's other people to step in and adjust that space to stabilize. So in a way, the safeguard there is in more connection, not limited connection. And it also means that the gifts of trust that we give are in small bite-sized pieces.
Yeah.
And some will have more than others and different elements of that trust. We will gift them different parts of visibility. Because trust is situationally specific. It's relationship specific. It's why, for instance, I have some friends that I would quite happily trust them to to order a decent bottle of wine, but you're damned if I'd ever lend them my car keys, because, I've seen how they drive behind my car and I'm not going to trust them with my car. There's that element of asking if somebody trusts you, or if they trust you isn't a simple question, because it's specific to the situation, the outcome, the element, the context.
Yeah. Well, with that, as you mentioned, you've fallen off that one big rock. But depending on the context again, where is that rock situated? If it does fall, that's going to be a landslide. And what goes with a landslide? A whole heap of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
You might end up getting buried at the bottom of it.
Yeah, and this is where, that's why I always advocate for pebbles, not rocks.
Yeah.
You might have the odd larger pebble in amongst there, but
Exactly.
all of these are grounded on a wider network underneath it.
Yeah, and there's no problem having a larger rock here and there. Just some of these small ones. You don't want to trust them with your car. But you might trust them to have a good barbecue and a good bottle of wine.
Yeah, and that's the nature of our relationships. They in themselves are a jigsaw. And each of those relationships will sit within one area of either our interests, our likes, our needs, our wants. They'll be in there, and
how we knit them together as well.
Yeah.
So
and we don't always have to.
No, because if they're well matched in a certain context, maybe there's a crossover somewhere else. Then that's perfect. That's good.
It comes back to that idea of Venn diagrams, because what we're talking about here is, first of all, is taking that disassociated set of boundaries that we've placed around everybody else, not around us, and reorientating it to where it should sit, which is around us.
Yeah.
And the next step within that is, while we do that, is reassessing our values and our beliefs. And that can be a major struggle.
Mm-hmm. Because as you mentioned previously, I think, is those values will shift over time. They're forever changing. So those values could be trust, honesty, integrity, discipline, and a whole host of other things as well in one situation, but they might be slightly changed in a level of hierarchy to yourself in another context.
Yeah, and this is where we will have core elements, which is almost our sense of morality, our sense of right and wrong, and it's a bit like understanding which are your big ticket items, you're beyond anything else. This is central to everything I believe and who I am, and therefore I will not ever compromise that. I won't ever have flexibility on that, and I'm not going to change on that. But the context of those values might.
Yeah.
And as a result, our interpretation of it might alter slightly, but the value will still remain. And some of our values will fundamentally change as we grow because of our experiences.
Oh, definitely.
Same as our beliefs are changeable. Because
and some beliefs, and also some of those beliefs we have about ourselves can be let go as well. Because what purpose do they serve? Because there's always better and stronger beliefs out there that you can get hold of, that are more worthwhile to living a more fulfilling and rewarding life.
And that comes back to who you let into your house being your internal concept of self, your internal dialogue. Because quite often some of the beliefs we hold are not ours, they're other people's. We don't always realize that because they are so familiar to us that we have overlaid them like an extra piece of clothing that we're choosing to wear.
well, that's a normal, isn't it? That's what becomes our normal, as we mentioned previously.
It is. And have you ever had long hair, Rich?
No, only if I've worn a wig.
Right, so this will probably be an alien concept for you. So I have over the years had quite a habit of kind of getting my hair to quite a decent length and then getting really fed up with it. And I'll walk in the hairdresser and go, do you know what, take it all off. And I'll go from like shoulder length to like above the ears in one cut. Now, the reason this is relevant for our conversation is because there is that adjustment period of a few days afterwards where I don't recognize myself, where you might catch sight of something at the corner in your periphery vision and you suddenly realize it's you with short hair, because that's not been familiar to you. It's not been your normal. And it's so your peripheral vision, your brain's going, what's that? And flagged it as something that's different, because we have an internal representation of ourselves. And that change has been so fast that my internal representation has not caught up with that yet. And that's the same with our beliefs and values. Sometimes it takes a while for our internal representation, when we start to change those and challenge our boundaries as well and set them. Our internal representation takes time to catch up with that, to be comfortable, for it to reintegrate into our normal. And that brings us back to the push me, pull me.
Yeah. One thing, instead of going out with fancy dress and coming back and not recognise, who's that in the mirror?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or going shopping for clothes and trying something that's really, really very different from your normal style, and feeling very out of place with it and not really quite sure in terms of whether this really actually is you, whether you're comfortable with that. When in actual fact, the knack of it is the repeated wear, because at some point that item will become an old favorite that's like just there. It's familiarity, it's practice, and it's the repetitive nature of it that embeds that into our normal. And this is where sometimes, with that military mindset, if there are embedded beliefs, embedded values, and an embedded dislocation of our boundaries that is around everybody else and not about us, it can be really challenging when we start to reassess this. It can feel very alien and very uncomfortable.
Especially upon leaving.
Especially upon leaving, yeah.
And we had a chat with a couple of friends of ours the other day, and they run a charity, and they were chatting about all these guys and gals who've left, and it may have taken them 10 years, at least, maybe even longer, to attempt to find out where they belong and who they really are. They'll go from I've done that, one job to another job to another job, or it'll be a case of somebody else I was chatting to is he was told, this guy was telling us other chap, a careers event, stay away from this organization, and this guy got talked into it. He ended up with a franchise and a whole host of chemicals and no work. Because even though the guy who took him round had his best intentions with him to say, look, stay away from there, he didn't listen, because he was talked into being told, yeah, you'll be doing X, Y, and Z, and you'll be able to do this, that, and the other.
Well, this is what happens when we are unclear on who we are, on where our boundaries sit. and what our values and beliefs are about ourselves, it places us again in that position of vulnerability. And if you have a background that has ACEs in the background where you have that over self-reliance, you already have issues in terms of creating that network, sustaining it and building those relationships, giving your trust, then
sorry, Ali, can we just explain what ACEs are for the people who are not sure?
yeah, so ACEs are adverse childhood experiences.
That includes such things as neglect, abuse of all sorts. Yeah, all that self-harm all that harm, injury, trauma, damage given by a caregiver.
And it can be things like financial strain, where you're raised in a household where there's significant financial constraints, where finance is a major issue, where there's instability in the relationships round about you, maybe where you're experiencing emotional distance from your caregivers, where they aren't meeting your emotional needs and your needs for reassurance. There might be physical abuse, there might be other traumas within there, but that abuse can also be emotional. It can be bullying behaviours, or it can be the total withdrawal, or it can be where you, as a child or young adult, are forced to take on more responsibility than you actually should be required to. Yeah. So you become the adult and the responsible person in that relationship. And that drives that sense of not having anybody else to rely on, and that sense of self-reliance. But it also gives a very limited experience of relationships. And it can lead to all sorts of issues in terms of creating those bonds, gifting of that trust, because you haven't learned that trust is ever respected as a child.
Yeah, and this is something we'll be exploring later, at a later date with somebody else.
Yeah, and I think we're probably going to do a very specific episode purely looking at ACEs and the impact on adults. But it's worth bringing up just now, just to kind of put in context why we're raising these elements here.
Definitely.
So in terms of those boundaries, coming back to that, part and parcel of that not knowing who you are is very much about the linkage between where your boundaries are sitting. Are they still disassociated from yourself, or have you reassociated them and attached them to you in the right way, in a positive way for you that respects your needs and wants, so that you are consistently placing yourself and your priorities first? And a lot of people struggle with that because they think it sounds selfish. It's not, it's anything but.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can also go to the if you're on a flight, who they say first. You got to put a face mask on yourself first before you look after anybody else.
Yeah, and that's very much. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so if you're not able to look after yourself first, you can't look after anybody else.
Yeah, and that's about recognizing that in order for you to be who you are, doesn't mean a depletion of you.
No.
It means a safeguarding of you so you can do more of what makes you you.
Yeah. I think it's also a rediscovery of who you are and who you want to be. That's all a ongoing, continuous process.
Well, that, like anything else, that also changes.
Yeah.
You know, with every life experience we have, every book we read, every concept we come across, every debate we either watch, listen, overhear, or engage with, something in us shifts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, most people, when they reach a certain age, aren't going out drinking, partying, whatever else, when they were late teens, early 20s. It looks probably can't keep up with that kind of thing anymore. So with that is a shift in maturity and perspective and bit of wisdom.
Well, I think it's also sometimes it's quite often linked to shifting what's important to us in our lives.
Yeah.
And that's often associated with shifting the circles round about us too, where their priorities shift, and as a result, so do ours. We start to want different things in our life and see the value in different things, which in the earlier periods of our life were maybe something that was for the future, but not for right now. And that's where, again, our inner sense of identity shifts.
Yeah. So I was going to think of that shift is looking at self-validation or validation, and how do you know that what you're doing is lifting you up and elevating you into a better place, and seeking that internal credit, internal satisfaction, internal sense of I'm doing okay and I'm improving somehow, and not getting those external rewards as what we mentioned previously, which are always good anyway to reward yourself, but those internal validations and rewards can help elevate that self-worth as well.
I think learning to self-validate is an important part of the reorientation of those boundaries, of the reattachment of those distance boundaries into the right place, of locking them in. Because we are not at that point then dependent on somebody else to tell us we are worth something.
Yeah.
We know it. And that's part of us recognizing that our worth means respecting our own needs. Our value means respecting our own needs.
And our wants.
And our wants. And with that will come a change in the beliefs we hold about ourselves.
Yeah. And with that, it doesn't mean that going around shitting on other people's.
Far from it.
Again, it's, as we mentioned earlier, it's all about compromise. And in some circumstances, you're going to have to put your needs and wants to one side for somebody else's.
But that doesn't mean to say we compromise on our value.
No, definitely not.
That's those in that situation what you're talking about, almost external wants and needs,
Yeah.
rather than internal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm sure I must have talked about this before, the lifeboat and lighthouse metaphor.
Oh, we did. You have, yeah.
But it's worth raising it again, because when we get caught in a pattern of demonstrating or confirming our value and our purpose, we get caught sometimes in the pattern of the actions we take to do so. And that means that our actions become almost cyclical. We repeat the same pattern to the same point. I mean, I know certainly that I for a long while was a cyclical workaholic and burnout, and I would recover from one burnout and I would vow never again. And then sure enough, at some point in the future, I would find myself at exactly the same point. And there was a cyclical nature to that. The pattern was familiar, the pattern felt secure, and I could kid myself that I knew I was going to do something different this time, but I would fall into old patterns very quickly.
Out of interest, what did you think you were going to do differently?
Well, at that point, I was externalizing the reasons for it and not recognizing my own role in that. I still wasn't acknowledging that I wasn't self-validating, that I was seeking validation externally, and I was still wearing my mask, because at that point my professionalism was what gave me that sense of purpose and that sense of value, that sense of the reason for why I was in these relationships. And until I learned to adjust that, and to adjust and learn to self-validate rather than looking for the external proof of my worth, then I repeated those behaviours. Because at that point, I hadn't realised that I wasn't the lifeboat. So I literally, and I used to tell people I love a burning building. So I worked in HR, and I used to reference the fact that I was really good in terms of crisis situations or dispute situations, anything where it all gone horribly wrong, send me in, I'll sort it, love it. Because that was kind of like the high octane, all hands to the pump. That was me in full lifeboat mode, pulling everybody into my boat and not paying attention to how exhausted I was, because my validation was coming from the results I was seeing from that, and the fact that I was sorting everything out. I was seeing that get fixed, but I wasn't taking care of my own needs in that, because the priority was putting the fire out.
Yeah.
And I thought I was the only one that could do that. And that sounds quite self-centered, and it wasn't. It's more the fact that I was so engaged in that, because that's where my validation came from, that I couldn't step away from it.
That's again going back to the potentially over self-reliance and being hyper dependent as well.
Yeah.
Not asking for that help.
100%. Yeah. The thought at that point of being reliant on anybody else would have probably brought me out in hives and, yeah, sent me running from the room. It was just totally alien concept. Utterly alien.
And he may have had that belief as well, is that your colleagues are potentially incompetent as well.
No, never that. It was just more that I was so engaged in that they would be observing their own boundaries.
Yes.
And they would be observing their own needs and their own self-care. And I hadn't learned to interpret that way. So my sense of responsibility would kick in. My sense of, well, somebody's got to do it. And because they were much better at assessing their own boundaries, at recognizing their own limitations and what was good for them and what wasn't, and I wasn't, then the craziness would land on me. And there was almost a sense of me reveling in that, because then I could be the lifeboat.
Yeah.
Then I could get the validation that I hadn't learned to give myself, to find for myself, because I didn't know what my role was otherwise.
No.
What purpose I served. I had to learn to be a lighthouse. I had to learn that my boundaries were important. And the patterns that I had from before were repurposed. So they now become warning flags for me, rather than things that take me to that route. They stop me in my tracks.
Yeah. It's what you mentioned previously about driving along the motorway, and there's all that signage up, and the bridge is out, or the road's out. And just carrying on doing whatever speed it is you're doing, and not recognising, and going, yeah, that's fine. Another couple of miles down the road, I'll be all right. And obviously getting closer and closer to that bridge going out. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's more warning signs. As you get closer, it's all flashing, barriers up, and all sorts, and maybe some workers out there trying to rebuild that bridge and just going to crash through all those barriers.
Because all I'm focusing on is the road in front, that and the end point of that destination. I'm not stopping to assess alternative routes, alternative options. and the warning signs that are saying this one's not going to work.
Yeah.
Because my focus is so narrowed by that point that I'm choosing to ignore the warning signs because they've always been there. I've just chosen not to acknowledge them. I have actively ignored them, and when people have pointed them out to me, I've been in utter horrified denial and thought that they were crazy.
I was so one of the guys I was doing some work with is he had a problem and his wife had told him about the problem and how he can go around solving it, or gave him an idea of how to solve it. And so we had a session together, and I said something very similar to what his wife was, but I'm guessing it's because I'm not in that intimate relationship. He took that on board and goes, "Oh, that's exactly what my wife has been saying."
But you often find that though, Rich, is actually what we do is we are pointing them to the obvious, but because we're taking it from a slightly different direction.
But I think it's also as well is that because we have the idea of about those who are nearest and dearest to us, we again have all these beliefs about who they are and this mold of who they are, and they step outside of that. It goes against the context, even though that's good advice what they're doing. But if somebody out from outside of their world or experiential zone, or whatever you want to call it, says something very similar, then people generally tend to take that on board.
But a lot of that sometimes is down to something that you can talk a lot about in transactional analysis, where we talk about gameplay. Now that's where, and there are some very interesting books out there. I do love Eric Berne's books because there's an element of where they look quite small. When you read them, they map out, and some of the books map out some of the common gameplays. And it's one of those ones I always say to people when they're reading them, read the gameplays first, then go back and read the explanations and the theory behind it, because it'll make it easier to reference. But expect to feel a bit uncomfortable, because there will be points of recognition where you go, oh, that's the argument I have with my sister every week, and oh my god, that's the argument I have with so and so, and yeah, that's a conversation that happens every time we go down that route with X, because they are so familiar in terms of the interactions, the patterns we fall into. That's because we literally go through our lives repeating mini plays.
We do.
And as a result, arguments will repeat themselves and they'll always end up at the same place. We'll throw the same comments, the same debates, the same points. And we fall into a pattern of familiarity where we stop listening so much or challenging or thinking so much because we are familiar with this route. We know what happens next. So our brain goes, well, this is an easy one. I know what to say next because that's what we've done the last 25 billion times, and it throws out the same language. But it takes us to the same bridge out. And in those situations, that's where we have to learn to be an impromptu performer, an ad-libber. Because if we want to move that relationship forward, what we have to learn to do is break the script.
Yeah. So with that, then you can literally approach a problem from, say, squatting down, use physical movement to examine and look at a problem and get a completely different perspective on it. Mm-hmm. because the brain or the brain's looking at it from your normal height. Mm-hmm. So maybe you squat down to, say, the height of a 5-year-old, or crawl around on the floor, whatever it is you're comfortable with doing, you may get a completely different perspective on how to approach a certain problem.
Well, that's because those plays will have positional placements within them. You look at theatre production, and it's a classic example of that. Each player will have its placement on the stage. The actions, reactions. So it's not just about the lines, it's about where they are when they say them. And we're exactly the same with our conversations. So what you're talking about there is breaking another pattern. And that's about where we are when we have that conversation, how we have that conversation, as well as the actual words we use and the script we're following. We have the choice to rip up the script and ad-lib it. And the minute we ad-lib it, we break a pattern, and both sides then have to put more consideration and more thought into the response. We hear things differently because we have to.
Yeah. The old adage from William Shakespeare, the whole world is a stage.
The whole world is a stage. And the knack is knowing our space within that stage and making sure that our space works for us.
Before the final curtain is drawn.
Well, let's face it, you don't want to stand in the trapdoor when you know it's going to open any second, do you?
Depends if that's part of the role.
Yeah.
Because standing in that limelight is uncomfortable, but also can be a good place to be at times.
That limelight is a place where we acknowledge our own worth, where we acknowledge our own value and our own needs. And it doesn't have to mean all eyes are on us. What it does mean is our eyes are on us. And that's when we know that those disenfranchised boundaries that were around everybody else, but never about around us, that's when we know that those boundaries have shifted back to where they should sit, around us. So we've covered quite a lot of ground there.
We have, yeah. I was thinking, and in summary, we've gone over, again, Ali's wonderful analogy of lifeboat and a lifehouse.
It's probably going to come up regularly.
Oh, standing on those pebbles or the rocks, which is the better ground for you to be stood on? A brief description of childhood ACEs, adverse childhood experiences.
The experiences that can lead to and how we carry those learnings through into adulthood and the impact that again has on that sense of value, that worth, and our inner beliefs and our boundaries.
Validation. Where can you find it? I don't know, but you got to find it somewhere.
Well,
It's
that's
nothing you grasp hold of.
And again, that's about learning to internalize that instead of placing that in something that ultimately drives the wrong behaviors, the wrong beliefs within ourselves. It's alignment of all of those things, because we can't pull one into play without impacting on everything else. So there's an element again in that push me, pull me, where part of that it will feel uncomfortable, but you know what? That means it's working.
Yeah.
That means things are shifting.
It is. And instead of having to look after your weapon, your equipment, and yourself, you got yourself to look after it with your wants and needs.
That's reversing that thee before me of the dislocated boundaries to me before thee. With a brief flash of a cat there. It's going to happen anytime, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. Done well so far. And where can they find us, Ali? Where can our listeners find us?
Oof. You can find us on YouTube, Apple, Amazon Music, Spotify, Castbox, Stitcher.
Yeah, and a couple of others. That'll do.
And a couple of others, yeah.
And we've also got a LinkedIn page and a Facebook page. So they're both called Rethinking Trauma and Transition. So we really do like to hear your comments, and please do like and rate the show wherever you can. Thank you very much.
Thank you.